Right now, across three of Europe's largest nations, walls of flame are moving faster than firefighters can track them. Entire towns are being emptied overnight, and the continent is living through what climate scientists are already calling one of the worst wildfire seasons ever recorded. This is happening right now in August of 2026. Spain has lost more land to fire this year than in any 12-month stretch since 2012. France just recorded its worst wildfire year since 2012 as well, with damage running more than 3 times its own 14-year average. Italy is enduring its 5th worst wildfire season in the past decade and a half. More than 300,000 people have been forced from their homes across France and Spain alone since late July, and the death toll across the continent has already climbed past 20. A number authorities warn is likely to keep rising as fires continue burning in multiple countries simultaneously. This is not a single dramatic blaze making headlines for a news cycle and then fading away. This is a continent-wide crisis unfolding across weeks, driven by a heat wave so extreme that scientists are calling it the most severe ever recorded in the region. A heat wave that has already killed far more people through heat itself than the fires have killed through flame. Today, we are going to break down exactly what has happened in Spain, in France, and in Italy, why the specific combination of weather conditions turned this summer into a genuine emergency rather than an ordinary bad fire season, what firefighters and emergency services are actually up against on the ground right now, and what the science tells us about why Europe keeps having summers like this one, and why they are very likely to keep getting worse. No exaggeration, no manufactured hysteria, just the facts, the numbers, and the honest picture of what is actually happening across an entire continent right now. Before we go any further, drop a comment and tell me if you or anyone you know has been affected by wildfires or extreme heat in Europe this summer. Because by the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly why this particular fire season has become so much more dangerous than the ones that came before it. If breakdowns like this help you actually understand the real scale of a disaster instead of just scrolling past a headline, hit subscribe so you catch every update as this crisis continues to unfold, and a thumbs up genuinely helps this reach more people who need accurate information right now rather than panic. Let us get into exactly what has happened. Let us start with Spain, because it has borne the heaviest burden of this summer's fires by almost every measure available. As of early August, Spain had already lost more than 150,000 hectares of land to wildfires since January, a figure Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez confirmed was 6 times higher than the area burned during the same period the previous year. That number kept climbing through the month, and by the time containment efforts began making real progress, Spain's total losses for the year had grown considerably further, putting 2026 on track to become one of the worst wildfire years the country has ever recorded, trailing only the catastrophic summer of 2022. The epicenter of Spain's crisis sat directly west of Madrid, where separate fires burning near Avila and Toledo eventually merged into a single, massive front that authorities described as the worst blaze in the entire history of the Madrid region. The Avila fire alone burned through roughly 50,000 hectares, making it, on its own, the largest single wildfire ever recorded in Spain's history. A genuinely staggering statistic, given how long and how thoroughly Spain has tracked its own wildfire data. A separate fire near La Mierla in Guadalajara province burned through approximately 35,000 hectares before firefighters finally managed to bring it down to a lower emergency classification. Emergency Services Director Virginia Barcones confirmed that Spain was fighting 14 major fires simultaneously at the height of the crisis, an enormous strain on a national firefighting apparatus that, however well-resourced, was never designed to manage that many large-scale blazes burning across the country all at the same time. It is worth pausing on what fighting 14 major fires simultaneously actually requires in practice, because the logistics involved are considerably more complicated than simply sending more crews to more locations. Spain's national firefighting resources, including specialized aerial tankers, ground crews trained in wildland fire suppression, and the command infrastructure needed to coordinate large-scale evacuations, are finite, and every one of those resources committed to containing the Avila-Toledo megafire is a resource unavailable to respond immediately to a new ignition breaking out elsewhere in the country. This is precisely the situation Spanish authorities found themselves managing throughout late July and early August, a rolling triage process where officials had to make genuinely difficult decisions about which fires posed the most immediate threat to human life, and which could be temporarily monitored with fewer resources, while crews focused on the largest, most dangerous fronts. That kind of resource-stretching scenario is exactly what officials mean when they describe a wildfire season as having overwhelmed normal operational capacity, not simply that individual fires were unusually large, but that too many large fires were burning simultaneously for any single national system to manage all of them with full force at once. France's experience this summer tells an almost equally alarming story, and it carries its own historical weight given the specific region where the worst of the destruction occurred. By the time this year's fire season peaked, France had burned through more than 115,000 hectares nationally, a genuine national record for the country. The single largest individual fire struck the Gironde region in southwestern France, ultimately consuming approximately 42,000 hectares, a blaze so large that officials described it as one of the largest wildfires France has experienced since the Second World War. A comparison that carries genuine historical weight in a country with as long and detailed a wildfire record as France maintains. More than 220,000 people were evacuated from the Gironde region alone, with an additional 30,000 evacuated from the neighboring Landes region, as fires swept through both areas in quick succession. To put France's overall 2026 total in proper context, the country's 14-year average for annual area burned sits at roughly 31,600 hectares. This year's figure came in at more than 3 times that average, and officials have confirmed that 2026 now stands as France's worst wildfire year since 2012. A full 14 years without anything approaching this scale of destruction. Italy's situation, while somewhat less catastrophic in terms of raw statistics than what unfolded in Spain and France, still represents a genuinely severe season by the country's own historical standards. Italy recorded roughly 79,000 hectares burned as of early August, placing 2026 as the 5th worst year for area burned across the past 15 years of Italian wildfire records. Fires spread across multiple regions of the country throughout the summer, compounded by the same relentless heatwave conditions driving destruction further west, with central and southern Italy repeatedly placed under extreme fire danger warnings from European monitoring agencies, as dry, hot conditions persisted week after week with little meaningful relief. And Italy's struggles did not exist in isolation. They were part of a broader pattern stretching across the entire Mediterranean basin, with Portugal losing more than 63,000 hectares to over 6,600 separate rural fires, and Greece, Croatia, and Turkey all battling their own significant blazes throughout the same stretch of weeks, turning what might otherwise have been described as a series of isolated national emergencies into something that genuinely deserves to be called a continent-wide crisis. The strain on Italy specifically has been compounded by the country's particular geography and settlement patterns, since so much of Italy's population lives in close proximity to exactly the kind of dry hillside terrain and forested countryside most prone to rapid fire spread during extreme heat. Central and southern Italy, the regions repeatedly flagged under extreme fire danger warnings throughout this summer, include a dense patchwork of small towns, agricultural land, and forested slopes that have historically proven difficult to defend once a fast-moving fire front develops, precisely because evacuation routes in mountainous or hilly terrain tend to be narrower and slower than the equivalent routes in flatter, more open countryside. Italian civil protection authorities have had to balance exactly the same resource allocation challenges facing their Spanish and French counterparts, coordinating aerial firefighting assets, ground crews, and evacuation orders across a country where the terrain itself often works against rapid, large-scale firefighting operations, even before accounting for the extreme heat and dry conditions driving the fires in the first place. To understand why this summer specifically turned into such an extraordinary fire season, you need to understand the very specific, almost cruelly precise sequence of weather conditions that came together to create it, because this was not simply a matter of one hot summer. Researchers with World Weather Attribution, the international scientific network that specializes in rapidly analyzing the links between specific extreme weather events and climate change, trace the roots of this crisis all the way back to January. In Spain specifically, January 2026 turned out to be the wettest January the country had recorded in a full quarter century, with rainfall in the specific area that would later become the Avila-Madrid-Toledo fire zone running 175% higher than usual. That unusually wet start to the year might sound like good news on the surface, but it set an extremely dangerous trap. All that additional rainfall fed an enormous surge in vegetation growth across the landscape, grasses, shrubs, and undergrowth, all growing far more densely than they would in a typical year, effectively loading the landscape with an unusually large volume of plant material. Then summer arrived, and that same landscape was hit with record-breaking heat and a severe drought, both conditions that researchers have directly linked to human-caused climate change. All of that lush vegetation that grew so vigorously during the wet winter dried out completely under the summer heat, transforming what had briefly been a green, healthy landscape into an enormous reserve of dry, highly flammable fuel spread across the exact regions that would go on to burn most catastrophically just months later. This specific pattern, an unusually wet period followed by an unusually hot dry one, has a name among fire scientists. They call it a whiplash effect. And researchers studying wildfire risk increasingly consider it one of the more dangerous and, in a strange way, counterintuitive consequences of a warming climate. A warmer atmosphere holds considerably more moisture than a cooler one, which means precipitation, when it does occur, increasingly tends to arrive in shorter, more intense bursts rather than spread evenly across the year, exactly the kind of pattern that produced Spain's unusually wet January. At the same time, that same warmer atmosphere also drives more frequent and more intense heat waves during the drier months, meaning the same regions that benefit from an unusually wet winter can find themselves, just a few months later, facing an unusually severe summer drought layered directly on top of all that extra vegetation growth the wet winter produced. Rather than canceling each other out, these two extremes compound one another, turning what might otherwise have been simply a good year for rainfall into the direct precondition for one of the worst fire seasons in the country's recorded history. Understanding this whiplash mechanism is genuinely important because it explains why a wet start to the year should never be read as reassuring news for fire risk later that same summer. In some cases, it can mean precisely the opposite. The heat itself deserves its own explanation because the numbers involved genuinely go beyond ordinary summer weather. According to the Copernicus Climate Change Service, the European Union's official climate monitoring body, June 2026 was the hottest June ever recorded across Western Europe, with average temperatures running roughly 3.05 degrees Celsius above the historical norm calculated from the period between 1991 and 2020. In certain locations, the anomaly was even more extreme, with temperature departures reaching as high as 9 degrees Celsius above normal across parts of France and Germany. The mercury hit 45, 1 degree Celsius at Andújar in southern Spain, and France recorded its hottest day since the country began keeping national temperature records back in 1947. Scientists at World Weather Attribution, after completing their rapid analysis of the event, described it plainly as the most severe heat wave ever recorded across the region, and they linked its extreme intensity directly to human-caused climate change rather than treating it as simply an unusually hot but otherwise ordinary summer. Crucially, this was not a single heat wave that arrived and then departed. 3 separate heat waves swept across the continent between late May and early July alone, each one adding to the cumulative drying effect on vegetation across the landscape. And further heat waves continued arriving through August, including London recording its 5th official heat wave of the year by mid-August, a genuinely remarkable frequency for a single summer. It also helps to understand exactly what scientists mean when they describe a heat wave as being directly attributable to climate change, since that phrase sometimes gets used loosely in ordinary conversation without the underlying methodology behind it being clearly explained. Researchers at World Weather Attribution use a specific, peer-reviewed technique that compares the observed characteristics of a real weather event, in this case, the extraordinary June 2026 heat, against large numbers of computer climate model simulations, some representing the world as it actually exists today, with roughly 3 degrees Celsius of human-caused warming already baked in, and others representing a hypothetical version of the same climate system without that warming. By comparing how frequently and how intensely an event of this scale would occur in each of those 2 scenarios, researchers can calculate a genuinely specific, quantifiable answer to the question of how much more likely and how much more severe human-caused climate change made a specific real-world heat wave. This methodology has been applied to numerous major heat events across Europe in recent years, and it has consistently found that many of the continent's most extreme recent heat waves would have been extraordinarily rare, in some cases statistically almost impossible, in a world without the warming humanity has already caused, which is exactly the kind of rigorous, falsifiable scientific claim that separates this conclusion from vague, generalized statements about climate change simply making things worse. It is worth pausing here to address something that tends to get lost in coverage, focused primarily on the wildfires themselves, because the heat driving this crisis has, in purely human terms, proven considerably deadlier than the fires it fueled. Official mortality data compiled by the Euromomo network, which tracks excess deaths across 27 European countries, recorded more than 10,000 excess deaths during the single peak heatwave week between June 22nd and June 28th alone. Separate analysis conducted by the news agency AFP placed the full toll for the month of June at a minimum of 12,000 deaths tied to the extreme heat, a count that researchers treat as entirely separate from, and considerably larger than, the direct death toll attributed to the wildfires themselves. This distinction matters enormously for understanding the true human cost of what Europe experienced this summer, because while burning buildings and evacuated towns generate the most immediately dramatic headlines and video footage, the quieter, less visually dramatic toll of extreme heat, particularly among elderly residents, people with pre-existing health conditions, and those without reliable access to air conditioning, has consistently proven to be the far larger killer during these events, a pattern researchers have now documented consistently across multiple recent European heatwave summers. This pattern is not new to this specific summer either. It reflects a trend researchers have been documenting and warning about for years. During the comparable 2025 European heatwave season, scientists estimated that as many as 16,500 deaths across the continent may have been attributable to climate change over the course of that single summer, representing roughly 68% of total heatwave-related deaths recorded during that period. That earlier analysis, produced through broadly similar attribution methodology to the work being applied to this year's crisis, illustrates that 2026's extreme heat toll is not some unprecedented, isolated anomaly. It is the continuation of an escalating pattern that has now produced back-to-back summers among the deadliest heat events in modern European history. Public health researchers studying this trend have repeatedly emphasized that heat deaths remain dramatically undercounted in official statistics in many countries. Since heat rarely appears as the sole listed cause of death on a death certificate, even when it directly triggered a fatal cardiac event, respiratory failure, or other medical emergency in someone already vulnerable due to age or pre-existing illness, meaning the true scale of this summer's human toll from extreme heat may not become fully clear for months after the immediate crisis has passed. Turning back to the fires directly, the human toll from the flames themselves has continued climbing steadily as the crisis has moved across the continent throughout the summer. By early August, fires had already killed at least 17 civilians, 6 firefighters, and 2 helicopter crew members, while forcing roughly 330,000 people from their homes across Spain and France combined. The crisis did not remain confined to the western Mediterranean either. It continued moving eastward as the summer progressed. In Croatia, police recovered the body of a woman from burnt scrubland near the coastal resort town of Omiš in mid-August after a fire swept through overnight, sending 40 people to the hospital, 10 of them requiring intensive care. Just days later, the crisis reached Greece, where 2 separate fires broke out within roughly half an hour of each other on the island of Salamina, west of Athens, and police recovered the bodies of an elderly couple in the aftermath. Taken together, official tallies now place the total confirmed death toll from this summer's wildfires across France, Greece, Spain, and Belgium at more than 20 people, a number that authorities and researchers alike expect to continue rising as assessment work continues in the hardest hit and most remote burned areas. The scattered cross-border nature of this death toll, civilians and firefighters lost in Spain and France, a woman found in Croatia, an elderly couple discovered in Greece, illustrates something important about how this crisis has actually unfolded that a single national headline could never fully capture. This was never a story confined to one country experiencing a uniquely bad summer. It was a rolling, continent-spanning emergency, with the same underlying heat wave and drought conditions sweeping progressively eastward across the Mediterranean over the course of weeks, striking one country's most vulnerable regions, and then moving on to the next, almost as soon as the previous nation's emergency services began making real progress toward containment. That rolling pattern is part of why the EU's centralized rescEU firefighting reserve has proven so essential this particular summer, since no single national firefighting service could reasonably be expected to maintain full readiness for a crisis capable of striking anywhere across a landmass spanning thousands of kilometers, sometimes with only days of warning between one country's emergency and the next. It is genuinely important to understand the mechanics of exactly how a fire season reaches this scale of destruction, because it is rarely just one single factor at work. It is several converging simultaneously, each one making the others considerably more dangerous. Drought-stressed vegetation, the kind produced by that unusually wet winter followed by an extraordinarily hot, dry summer, does not just increase how much material is available to burn, it fundamentally changes how fires behave once they ignite. Dry fuel burns hotter, spreads faster, and produces the kind of intense, erratic fire behavior that overwhelms conventional firefighting tactics built around more moderate, predictable fire spread. Combine that with sustained extreme heat, which further dries out vegetation in real time, even as a fire is actively burning, and add strong hot winds, a frequent companion to Mediterranean heat wave conditions, and you get exactly the kind of fast-moving, unpredictable fire fronts that forced the Avila and Toledo blazes to merge into a single, uncontrollable front covering 80,000 hectares, and that allowed the Gironde fire in France to expand to the point where it now ranks among the largest the country has witnessed since the Second World War. Firefighters describe these conditions using the term extreme fire behavior, a technical designation for fires that move and spread in ways that exceed the normal operational assumptions built into standard firefighting strategy, forcing crews to prioritize evacuation and containment of the fire's edges over any realistic hope of directly extinguishing the main body of the blaze until weather conditions themselves finally shift. The response to this crisis has required a genuinely unprecedented level of coordination across the entire European continent, reflecting just how widely distributed the emergency has become. The European Union's rescEU fleet, the bloc's dedicated firefighting reserve designed specifically to be deployed wherever member states become overwhelmed by their own national resources, has had 22 firefighting aircraft and 5 helicopters positioned on standby across 12 different countries throughout the crisis, alongside 777 pre-positioned firefighters, the largest mobilization the program has ever conducted since it was first established. Both Spain and Portugal formally activated the European Civil Protection Mechanism, the EU's broader system for requesting emergency assistance from fellow member states, a step that reflects just how far beyond the capacity of any single national firefighting service this summer's demands have run. This kind of cross-border mobilization has become an increasingly familiar pattern in recent European wildfire seasons, but the scale and duration of this particular deployment, sustained continuously across multiple countries for well over a month at this point, illustrates just how much more frequently and how much more severely these resources are now being called upon compared to summers even just a few years in the past. It is worth being honest and specific about the economic dimension of this disaster too, because the visible destruction of homes and forests represents only part of the true financial toll. Professor Simone Verato of Henley Business School at the University of Reading has noted directly that measuring the true cost of a wildfire season like this one is genuinely complicated, since the burned area itself is comparatively easy to measure using satellite data. But the full economic impact requires accounting for an entire cascade of secondary effects, destroyed homes and businesses, ruined agricultural crops across some of Europe's most productive farming regions, disrupted tourism during the peak summer travel season in exactly the countries that depend most heavily on that tourism revenue, and industries interrupted by evacuation orders, smoke, and damaged infrastructure. Separate research examining the broader economic implications of Europe's escalating heat crisis has estimated that extreme heat and its associated disasters could cost a single major city like London up to £36 billion annually by the 2050s if current climate trends continue without significant additional adaptation investment, a figure that helps illustrate just how enormous the compounding, long-term economic stakes of this pattern actually are, well beyond the immediate cost of replacing burned homes and forests this particular summer. There is also a specific research finding worth understanding in detail, because it speaks directly to where this entire pattern is actually heading, rather than just where it currently stands. Scientific modeling has found that the total area affected by wildfires across Europe could triple by the end of this century if global average temperatures rise by 6 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, a warming scenario that remains entirely plausible under current global emissions trajectories if meaningful policy changes are not implemented. That same research offers a genuinely important counterpoint worth taking seriously, finding that improved fire management practices, better forest thinning, more strategic prescribed burning, and stronger early detection and rapid response systems could reduce the burned area outcome by as much as 92% even under that same high warming scenario. Though the researchers themselves caution that this more optimistic outcome depends on genuinely sustained, well-funded investment in exactly those kinds of management practices across every country in the affected region, rather than assuming the technology and policy will simply improve on their own without deliberate, coordinated effort. It is worth being direct about the underlying climate mechanism driving this pattern, because understanding the actual physics helps separate genuine scientific concern from vague, generalized climate anxiety. Researchers point to several specific interacting factors behind this summer's extreme heat. Changes to the position and behavior of the jet stream, the fast-moving band of air high in the atmosphere that normally helps steer weather systems across the continent, combined with the influence of El Niño conditions in the Pacific Ocean, and hotter than usual sea surface temperatures across the Mediterranean and North Atlantic. Together, these factors combine to lock a persistent dome of hot, dry air directly over much of the European continent, not just once, but repeatedly, for the 4th time since May by the point this year's most severe heatwave struck. This is precisely the kind of atmospheric configuration that climate scientists have consistently warned becomes both more frequent and more intense. As global average temperatures continue rising, a warmer atmosphere and warmer oceans provide considerably more energy to sustain these kinds of persistent blocking heat patterns once they form, and a warmer baseline climate means that when a heat wave does occur, it now builds from a meaningfully higher starting point than an equivalent event would have just a few decades ago. None of this should be read as an assertion that every single wildfire ignites specifically because of climate change in some direct, one-to-one sense, since the overwhelming majority of individual wildfire ignitions still trace back to specific human causes, whether accidental, such as agricultural equipment sparking dry grass or an improperly extinguished campfire, or, in some documented cases across this summer's fires, deliberate arson. What climate change demonstrably does, according to the consistent findings of organizations like World Weather Attribution, is dramatically increase the underlying conditions that transform an ordinary ignition into a catastrophic, uncontrollable fire, hotter temperatures, drier vegetation, and more frequent, more intense heatwave conditions that together create exactly the kind of tinderbox landscape capable of turning a single spark into a fire covering 50,000 hectares within days. That distinction between what starts a fire and what allows a fire to become genuinely catastrophic once started is exactly the kind of nuance that matters for understanding both the honest science behind this summer's disaster and what genuinely effective prevention efforts would actually need to target going forward. For anyone watching this unfold from outside the directly affected regions, wondering what a summer like this one actually signals about the years ahead, the honest scientific answer is sobering without needing any exaggeration to make the point land. This is not the first severe European wildfire summer in recent memory. Comparable, though not identical, crises struck in 2022 and again in 2025, each one contributing its own devastating statistics to an increasingly troubling multi-year trend. What distinguishes this particular summer is the sheer breadth of the crisis. Genuinely severe, record-breaking or near record-breaking fire activity, striking Spain, France, and Italy simultaneously. Compounded by a heat wave, scientists have already labeled the most severe ever recorded across the region. And a death toll from heat alone running into the thousands, even before accounting for the separate toll from the fires themselves. Understanding this as a single connected crisis, extreme heat driving both mass casualties directly and catastrophic fire conditions simultaneously, rather than as several separate, unrelated national news stories, is exactly the kind of clear-eyed picture that actually helps make sense of why this summer has felt so relentless across so much of the continent at once. There is a broader lesson here too, one that extends beyond any single country's response or any single summer's statistics. Europe has now experienced genuinely severe, headline-making wildfire and heat crises in 2022, again in 2025, and now once more in 2026, a pattern that has shifted from occasional exceptional events into something researchers increasingly describe as the new normal for Mediterranean and Western European summers. That shift carries real implications for how governments plan infrastructure, how insurance markets price risk in fire-prone regions, and how ordinary residents across the affected countries think about summer itself. No longer simply a season of heat and vacation, but one that now regularly demands genuine vigilance, evacuation readiness, and for an increasing number of families each year, the grim possibility of losing a home, a farm, or a loved one to conditions that a warming climate has made measurably more likely and measurably more severe than they would have been just a generation ago. We will be watching closely as recovery and containment efforts continue across the affected regions, as damage assessments extend into the hardest hit rural communities, and as the confirmed death toll, tragically, continues to be updated in the weeks ahead. If this breakdown helped you understand the real scale and the real science behind a disaster that deserves far more than a scrolling headline, share it with anyone you know who has friends, family, or connections anywhere across Spain, France, or Italy right now. Drop a comment sending your support to the communities and firefighters working through this crisis, and subscribe so you catch every update as this story continues to develop. This is a disaster still actively unfolding across an entire continent. The people fighting these fires, evacuating their homes and burying their loved ones deserve nothing less than our full attention and understanding as Europe works through what is already being described as one of the most severe wildfire seasons in its modern history.